Good evening, fellow Bible nerds. I'll start with a short introduction. My name is Noah. You don't know me. This is my first video ever. I never thought I would do anything like this, but I'm a researcher and a digger, and I got hung up on one verse way back when, about 13 years ago, and ever since then I have followed that single verse down a literal rabbit hole. So I spent 6 years in the Navy doing intelligence and analysis, which kind of trained my brain to go digging and searching for answers and clues to things that weren't blatantly obvious. So when I got to Isaiah 27:9, it really kind of stuck in my craw. So ultimately, this whole passage is an end times prophecy. But in verse 9, he says, "Therefore by this shall the iniquity of Jacob be forgiven." Jacob being Israel, the lost tribes, the Christian church. As we know, Paul talked about the cultivated tree and the wild tree, saying that if the original branches could be cut off of the original tree, then we, being wild branches that were grafted on afterwards, are much more in danger of the fire than the original branches. So when you see these passages referring to Jacob and his great sin and how it's not going to be atoned for until something happens, you best pay attention. So in verse 9, when he says, "All this will be the full fruit of taking away his sin, that he makes all the stones of the altar as chalk stones that are beaten in sunder, so that the Asherim and the sun images or sun pillars shall rise no more." Now, it's really easy to just read over that verse because it's so dense, and you can go so many different ways with it. But also, most of your Bibles are going to change that word Asherim and sun pillars, so it's even easier to read over because it doesn't seem like anything specific. It just says in most translations sacred pillars or sacred stones or carved images or idols, and it's very oblique. There's not a lot of definition given. But when it specifically says Asherim and sun images, and that's according to the Hebrew, not some translations actually accurately translate it, but the Hebrew is the one that specifically goes Asherim and sun pillars. So anyway, when you look at that and you go, okay, hold on. So the full fruit of taking away Israel's sin will be when they break down their Asherim and their sun images. And for any Christian, this is kind of a conflict of interest because we know that Jesus came and he died and he took away our sin. But there's one additional verse a little bit further in Isaiah 59, verse 1 and 2, where he says, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, or his ear dull, that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear." So ultimately, I meant to put that in the presentation, but I'll have to add it in later. Anyway, ultimately what that is saying is that until the sins that Israel committed are done away with and not continued anymore, we cannot be atoned for. So essentially, Jesus can save us anytime, but he doesn't forgive us for sins that we're currently partaking in. And I will start with a caveat here saying that these issues that I'm bringing up are not here to castigate anybody or to judge, because ultimately this is stuff that I have found was hidden from all of us for millennia. And it's been hidden purposely by the serpent because he knew that if we knew what was going on, we wouldn't do it. So he got us to secretly carry out a lot of these practices that I'm going to dig into. So ultimately this study is on the great harlot of Revelation and the greater Exodus. So ultimately, the great harlot of Revelation gives a lot of detail on that final beast's kingdom and why it's being judged and how it's being judged. And the information isn't blatantly obvious in Revelation. You have to trace it back through other points in the Bible and understand what he's talking about, which is why it says so many times, let the reader understand, because he's saying I'm referencing another part of Scripture. So ultimately, this great harlot is the thing keeping Israel from the greater Exodus. And that's why it stuck in my craw so much, because he's saying the full fruit of Israel's sin being taken away will be, so when his sin is taken away, this is how we'll know. He'll do these things. So God is saying, I'm ready to take your sins away as soon as these things stop happening. And then the greater Exodus occurs, but it has to be spiritual first. So ultimately, this presentation is the study that I've done over the last 10 to 15 years trying to piece this together. And again, this has no castigation to anybody who's doing anything in this presentation, because it's all been hidden, it's become secret, we've lost the meaning, and this is purposely because just like Balak asked Balaam to get Israel to sin so that they could wipe them out in combat, the same thing has happened where the devil knows that if we're obeying God's words, which we all want to do, then we'll be protected. And so he gets us to sin without knowing it, and that keeps us from getting the full measure of our protection. So to start out, he tells the end from the beginning, so I'm going to start in the end, and then we're going to try, excuse me, then we're going to trace the major elements of this harlot back through other scriptures and find connecting pieces and see what it's talking about. So in Revelation 17, 1 through 5, it talks about this great harlot. And it says, Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. And with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on the earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. And it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Obviously, as all the Bible buffs know, this is referring to the kingdom, the 7 points of power, or the 7 capitals, the 7 leaders, and the 10 horns, which is the 10 kings that lead over this whole system. So this is a hypothetical beast referring to kingdoms. That's going to be important later. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. Every single one of these reference points is quoting something scripturally, and it's not until you go back and understand what each one of these things is tracking that the picture starts to come together of who is being judged biblically. So to start out from that one passage, we're going to break down the basics to start. So we know she's the mother of prostitutes, and she's also the mother of all the abominations of the earth. What are the abominations? The prostitute rides the beast, or in essence, the nations that bow down to her and cultivated her worship. So she sits in rulership and in authority of them. And she is filled with blasphemous names, meaning many languages, many tongues, many names. That woman will be known throughout the world under different names. She comes out of the waters, and according to verse 15, the angel tells John that the waters is symbolic of the peoples or the nations. So she's the mother of abominations. In Deuteronomy 13, verse 16 and 17, it says, They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons who were not gods to gods, whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, who your fathers did not dread. Deuteronomy 7:26 says, You shall not bring an abomination into your house, and like it come under the ban. You shall utterly detest it, and you shall utterly abhor it, for it is something banned. So a question here that I'll just ask and leave with you, because this was a question that I had in the back of my head for years as I dug all this up. How can we learn how to detest these abominations if we don't know what they are and what they look like? Because as the witnesses to the evil of the world, we're meant to identify the evil and know to choose the good versus the bad. So we see the evil and we detest it, but if that evil is hiding and we don't understand what it is or what it means, then we can't detest it. So we're supposed to abhor it because it is something that is banned and evil. So in Ezekiel, he says, the angel told him, Son of man, raise your eyes now toward the north. So I raised my eyes toward the north, and behold, to the north of the altar gate was this idol of jealousy. And this is in reference to the abomination that causes desolation at the entrance. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing, the great abominations which the house of Israel are committing here, that I should be far from my sanctuary? So this was the first instance of the abomination that causes desolation. The verbiage and the language are the same. And in essence, what you're seeing, God is walking Ezekiel through the evils of Israel and what they're doing in the temple. And instead of worshiping him, they're worshiping all of these elements of death and worshiping all the pagan gods. So this idol of jealousy was kind of the crown on the head of the gods, and we'll dig into what that idol of jealousy truly was, because when the abomination of desolation is set up in the holy place in the end of times, if we don't know what this idol of jealousy was in the first place, then we won't identify it or know what to look for. So that's actually a very key point in understanding what to look for into future prophecy as well. So it's kind of a pivot point, because you know here that God says, because of these abominations which Israel is committing in my house, I should be far away from my sanctuary. So God can't sanctify it even in his own house. This goes against the Christian stricture that anything that anything can be sanctified, anything can be made clean, because God himself left his own temple, his own house, because of these abominations. He had the right and the authority to just burn them out and tell him to start from scratch. But he himself left his home. And if he will leave his own home, it's not a stretch by any means that he will leave our homes if we have these things in them. Therefore, if Revelation describes the great prostitute as the mother of all abominations, she is in fact the mother of all the gods, or the idols. Idols steal the rightful worship from God, which is the great crime that the harlot stands in judgment for. If the abominations are idols, then reasoning this out, the prostitute's cup is filled with the idols of the earth, and the the wine in that cup is the blood sacrifices that are conducted and given to this woman and all of her idols. So riding the beast with the blasphemous names, she's depicted as being in authority over them. So in essence, if this is going to line up, I'll take a pause for a moment and introduce my wife, Anna.
You're gonna take a pause now.
Well, you're here.
Of all places, of all times, okay. This isn't live.
Jarring. No, it's not. I'm
Okay,
just recording.
thank God.
So my wife helped me to coordinate and line all of this up. I've been researching this for years and gave her a giant jumble of information. And she's sort of helped me to piece it together in a legible manner that should follow a logical track. And when we come to the pictures and the primary sources from the depictions and the carvings and epithets, she's going to do the translations of those, because she's more of an imagery oriented mind, and she did a lot of study on how those images depicted and connected with the rituals and the deities that we were digging into. Bye. So if this is going to track, ultimately we have to set our scientific method into this. And if this lines up, if the deity that we find is in fact the prostitute of Revelation, she will be a single goddess or idol known throughout the world and in Scripture, and she'll be known by many names, and this will point us to the great prostitute of Revelation 17. If we look at the identifying features given, since she has so many names, the Bible's telling us you have to look past the names and look at the features, the identifications, and the elements that this woman was known by. So she was the mother of all the idols, which should lead us to the one entity, no matter what religion or um, background she comes from. She'll be in worldwide authority to this day. Otherwise, she doesn't fit the prophecy, because that prophecy is given at the very end, which hasn't come true yet. So this woman will still be in authority if we're correct. And we do see different embodiments of this great prostitute throughout Scripture. Just as we see embodiments of Jesus through the life of David, Moses, and Joseph, the way those righteous men were used to paint a picture to say who Jesus would be, you also have the inverse, where the evil men and women in the Bible all kind of lined up and painted a picture as to the final fulfillment of that evil. And so ultimately you do have this light, dark, life, death, blessing, curse separation in the Bible, and all of the righteous paint the picture of the ultimate righteous, who is Jesus, and all of the wicked line up to paint the picture of the ultimate evil, who is this great prostitute. So where do we see these embodiments and qualities? The most obvious embodiment is Jezebel. So Ahab took for his wife Jezebel, or Jezebel, who was the daughter of Etbal, king of the Sidonians. And he's the high priest of Baal. So Jezebel takes the worship of Baal and Asherah, and she brings it to Israel, specifically Samaria. And Ahab immediately begins worshiping Asherah by making an Asherah and building a temple of Baal in Samaria. And Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Jezebel here is playing the part of the great harlot prophetically. Her sins, idolatry and sexual immorality, which are recorded in 1 Kings, line up directly with the sins described that the harlot of the world is being judged for. The name Jezebel in Hebrew means Baal has exalted, which is a blasphemous name against Elohim, and again you see her riding on this beast. If Baal exalted her, he's giving her power, he's giving her authority. So Jezebel incited King Ahab of Israel to bring Asherah and Baal idolatry to Israel on a national scale. And Jezebel led Israel into this idol worship in the same way that the great harlot leads the world into idol worship. Here are some of the cross-reference verses where in 2 Kings, Joram saw Jehu and says, "Is it peace, Jehu?" And Jehu answered, "What peace can there be as long as the whorings and the sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many?" In Nahum 3:4-5 it says, "All because of the wanton lust of a prostitute, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution, and peoples by her witchcraft. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness, and the kingdoms your shame." And in Revelation 2:20 we cross-check with all of these where the church, I forget which church it is off the top of my head, Jesus is talking to the churches, and he says, "I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality, and to eat food sacrificed to idols." So we know that if Jesus is reprimanding the church for following this woman, that believers will be judged for partaking in the idol worship as seen in Revelation 2. Therefore, it is vital that we know what this worship entails and what it signifies, so that we don't partake. How can we avoid being led astray and deceived by the harlot if we don't understand what her and her worship look like? The worship that the great harlot is being judged for is not named specifically in Revelation, but through the prophetic significance of her counterpart Jezebel, we can infer the harlot's worship through the worship of Jezebel, since she led Israel in the worship of Baal and Asherah. We can begin kind of digging into the actual idol that Jezebel led Israel in and see if it stacks up with the imagery we see so far. So, who is Asherah? We've seen the name pop up a couple times so far. And I'm going to give you guys a warning here. I should have given you a warning at the beginning. This is a very, very dense study. And it's frying my brain just going through it. So I completely understand. Just buckle up and pause it as much as you need to and cross-check. I'm not asking you to take anything I have dug up or found as gospel, but it will take some time to dig in and look at the references, look at the sources, and look at any cross-reference you need, because ultimately this is very dense and it takes a long time to piece together the depth of it. So the beginnings of the period we were dealing with here, this is a quote from Patai, I believe that was the sacred tree. Patai says, for about 6 centuries thereafter, that is to say, down to the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, the Hebrews worshipped Asherah, and next to her also other originally Canaanite gods and goddesses, in most places and times. He further goes on to state, the Asherahs were often set up next to the altar of Baal, and the word Asherah can refer to the goddess herself or to her image. And this is a non-biblical reference. This is a purely archaeological find. So next we're going to cross-reference the biblical accounts and see if this all matches up. So he further states that Asherah held the position of the chief mother goddess. So we're already seeing a connection to the Revelation woman, who she was the mother of the Abominations. So Hadley in the Golden Bough, I'm going to use a lot of Hadley, and that's specifically because his entire book, The Golden Bough, was originally 12 volumes long. He spent his entire life work doing it, and it makes up the trunk of my study. But I have a host of cross-references and secondary and primary sources to verify what Hadley found, and so far I have found nothing that he put down as being inaccurate. So you can check that for yourself, but Hadley is a major source for this study. He states, it is true that on the basis of recent study into the iconography of Asherah, many scholars now believe that the symbol of the goddess Asherah was some sort of a stylized tree. And stylized tree here is essentially any tree that is not natural. If you look up the dictionary definition, it's a tree that is outside of the regular norm. So any kind of decorations, anything you... Okay. Thank you. It means to represent or make or conform to a particular style. So you're removing it from its natural form and making it conform into something else. One of the translations of Asherah in Hebrew, Sacred Grove is not the only translation, but it's one of the ways that scholars translate that word. But if we're going to go to Scripture and look at where Asherah pops up, again, a lot of your Bibles are going to change this word, so you have to actually go to the Hebrew or do some cross-referencing of different translations to find the ones that use the proper word here. And this shows how important it is for them, for us, sorry, for them to keep us from understanding who this is, because they hide and obscure the name so that you don't understand what they're referring to. So Exodus 34 says to smash their sacred pillars and to cut down their asherim. Notice the verbs that it's using here. If we're talking about a pole or a carved idol, there's no cutting, there's no hewing, and there's definitely no planting, as in Deuteronomy 16:21, where he says, "You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree besides the altar of the Lord your God." So here we already see a direct contradiction to this Baal worship, where Baal worship always involved setting up an altar for Baal and planting an Asherah next to it. God immediately says, "Do not plant a tree by any altar. I'm not married to this woman. I'm not married to anyone except Israel, my people. Don't pretend. Don't play the game. I'm not interested." And we're going to find out nobody listened. Judges 6:25, this is when the angel of the Lord's talking to Gideon. He tells him to pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that's beside it. Again, you have this cult practice of having the altar and the tree next to it. And God tells him, get rid of both. And then you're to offer a burnt offering using the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut. Do you want to explain this?
This is a jar from that was found in, I believe, Israel. Um, and it says, Amariah said to my Lord, "May you be blessed by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah. Yahweh bless you and keep you and be with you." So it's, as you can tell, a bastardization of the Aaronic blessing of the Levitical priesthood, by adding his Asherah, because they were married in this uh, script. And there's not much information about the drawings down here, but it's more about the script in this particular artifact.
Thank you. There will be more of that to come. So again, we're going to go to this deception element of this, where the NIV especially is notorious and rampant. I'm sure a lot of you have found other issues with the NIV. The NASB was one of the translations that doesn't obscure it. In the NIV, it straight up says, "Do not set up any wooden Asherah pole besides the altar." The NASB says, "You shall not plant an Asherah." So NIV removes the word plant completely because they want... You're distracting me. Can you not...
I'm sorry, I don't know where to go. How do I do
Just, these aren't going to work.
Oh, okay. We can cut that out.
Hopefully.
I'm sure we could. It looks easy enough.
Oh no, what happened? Okay. So, as I was saying, NIV specifically cuts out the word plant and puts set up in its place. Going back to the golden bough, Hadley states that the idea that a cultic object can bear the same name as the deity which it represents is not necessarily a foreign concept to the people of the ancient Near East, to whom the worship of the symbol of a god or goddess was identical with the worship of the deity represented. That's a super dense way to say everybody that back then understood that worshiping an image and worshiping the god were synonymous. So a symbol or an actual cult item or the god were all synonymous. It didn't have to be a specially sacred object. The symbol itself could be associated with that god. It is therefore not unreasonable to assume that the same term Asherah can be used to describe both the goddess and the symbol of the goddess. So where her symbol is, she is present. Asherah is a Canaanite Sidonian representation of the well-known Egyptian goddess Isis. In Deuteronomy, after God took the Hebrews out of Egypt, he instructed them to leave behind all of their gods and all their images. He commanded them to not bring these images into their homes. This was not a foreign concept to the Hebrews, who saw the Asherah and the sun pillars and the rituals associated with them surrounding every corner of Egypt during their captivity. So going into the next section, we're going to prove that out, where God wasn't telling them not to do something that they weren't familiar with. They all knew exactly what it was he was saying not to do. They saw it on a daily basis in Egypt. They were there for 430 years, and by the time they left, the religion had become so integrated into their own that the whole wilderness period was God trying to strip them of these pagan, cultic Egyptian mindsets, and they just would not let them go. So, to start out drawing this Asherah connection to Isis, we're going to see that this tree goddess, or the Lady of the Sycamore, was usually identified with either Nut, Hathor, or Isis, which were Egyptian fertility goddesses. And this seems like a little bit of a bounce, but we're going to circle back and make the full connection from Isis to Asherah, so bear with me. There's a lot of information to sift here. In most tombs, she is portrayed as a wood nymph within the tree. So here we've got one of the very well-known images of Nut, and the image down here at the bottom is actually Nut's hieroglyphic name. So the fact that you see the goddess, you see the tree, and you see the name all painted into one picture shows that each one of them is its own piece of the puzzle. And where one exists, all of them do. And you see the big snake down here at the bottom. That's going to be important later. It's blatantly obvious once it all comes together, but here you see Nut feeding her worshippers or her supplicants with the water or wine from this tree of wisdom. Here's another representation. Do you want to describe the pictures?
Yeah, it's nearly the exact same image. As you can tell, she is not only is she in the tree, this displays that it's synonymous with the image. The deity is the image, and the image is the deity. They're one and the same by showing her in the tree. So that's a very important part. And as you can tell, she's feeding these worshippers food
Here,
and
I'm going to give
water
you these
from
for
the
this
tree.
part.
Okay, excuse me. They can hear.
I'm sure it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so that's essentially the important parts. Is as you can tell throughout these images, they the the goddess is in the tree. She's amongst the tree, and that shows not only ownership, but it shows that they are synonymous images. So, there you go.
Hold on, there's a few more.
Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. So here's another. So this is very similar. This is Newt. This is very similar with the other images we've seen. She's offering, her worshippers the same. And you see her once again. She's a part of the tree. And even in this one, so much so that it's blended into the tree. So that's interesting. So this is interesting. This is, I believe, Isis.
And Thoth.
And Thoth, right? And then there's a deity. I want to say it's Osiris because of the. I'm not quite sure though. But he's once again in the tree. It's like synonymous, showing that this is synonymous with its image. This comes into play later on, so keep that in mind. This star image and this moon crescent. And then here's a carving of Isis, the same thing, giving I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that name, and Kaye, food
Jehudi
and
Hotep,
water.
I believe.
Food and water for their probably journey to the underworld, because that was very, very common in carvings of tombs, is for
To have
Isis
that
to
portal
give
element.
Isis to give food and water along the way to the underworld. So.
Okay, there's more.
So here's another one. I mean,
Keep
it's the
in.
same thing. Once again, it's blended. There's this blending right here of Newt giving food, being the tree. This one's quite interesting because you see them giving reverence to these trees, and as we'll explain later, and you'll see it a lot, when there are images, yeah, there's like nowhere to put, there's nowhere to put me. There's so much.
There's definitely nowhere to put you.
So, this is very interesting. So you'll see this all throughout ancient iconography and ancient pagan images, that each image that's vertical or next to displays ownership and cohesiveness of that deity. So here we have the cow, and ironically enough, we know of the golden calf, right? That comes specifically from Hathor, the mother deity of Egypt, ancient Egypt. And there we have the sun. But here is the cow that is Hathor, the mother goddess. So when they were carving this image, and they said, "Oh, we'll worship Elohim. We'll worship him by erecting um, this golden calf, and he'll reside in it, and he'll be that deity," because that's what they knew from Egypt. They were familiar with that. They saw golden cows everywhere.
And they specifically said,
And
today is a feast to the Lord.
yes,
Moses died. Or they thought Moses had died. He was their mediator. So
yes,
they didn't get a new god. They got a new intercessor.
exactly.
And that was still seen as blasphemy.
So they literally, and there were several golden actual golden cow heads of Hathor. So this is an image that they were familiar with. This isn't just this random, oh, let's just pick a cow. It was something that they had seen over and over, and that's why they chose that image. It's not random by any stretch of the imagination. And then also you notice how she's right next to these trees, and they're giving reverence not only to the sun, which we'll get into, and we'll get into there's Hathor, the mother goddess, but then they're also giving reverence to these trees, and she's in front of these trees, like showing ownership. And that's huge in all kinds of ancient iconography, hieroglyphs, you name it, artifacts. They all show ownership of these other items that is a part of it. You see, here we go. This is a very interesting one. You see that there's a tree. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm very tech illiterate, so yeah, we don't even really need this part at the end. I'll move this just a smidge. So you see here, this is quite interesting. We have, I believe it's also Newt. And there's a tree shooting up.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, the tree goddess. Yes, so this is Lady of the Sycamore, so this is Newt. And the tree is straight up shooting out of her head. And that's like straight up showing ownership. This is insane. And it says her head nourishes a variety of growing things, including grapevine. This is 1550 BCE to 1290, around the time. So here we have, this is quite interesting.
And the grapevine is blasphemous because God says Israel is my grapevine.
Yes.
So she's depicting Israel as growing out of
Yeah.
her.
So here's something else that's quite just astounding, and there's several right here too. It's from the tomb of Roy. This is circa 1300 BCE, roughly the 17th dynasty. If you're an Egypt buff, and we have some Sem priests that are all. It's so interesting, and you see these images here. They're different like shrubs that have been like uplifted, but these are just insane. We have these decorated, and here's a bigger picture. We have these decorated.
Let's move you again.
these decorated they were plants woven together, but what does it look like to you? It looks straight up like a tree, and he's lighting it with candles at the top. And then at the bottom is offerings of food and and onions and all kinds of things. So so these specifically are offerings for Roy, who the tomb was for Roy and his wife. And this tree was adorned with all of these onions and flowers and these offerings so that they, when they left their bodies, their departing spirit could collect these offerings and they would eat it along the way to the underworld, because the underworld was this long, tenuous, insane journey in ancient Egyptian mythology. So there's a little bit of that. I think we're back to you.
All right. Thank you, honey.
Yeah.
Could you refill my coffee?
Guess so.
All right, and we're back. So the original meaning of the goddess Isis is more difficult to determine than that of her brother and husband Osiris. Her attributes. So I'll pause there and go back to Ahab's meaning. Ahab was Jezebel's husband, but his name Achav means both brother and husband, or sorry, brother and father, and obviously he was Jezebel's husband. One of the references in her name actually means, one of the translations of her name means the unmarried, essentially. So with Isis's name, you're already seeing some relational correlations to the name meanings of Jezebel and Ahab in their relationship. But anyway, according to Frazer in The Golden Bough, he says her attributes and epithets were so numerous that in the hieroglyphics she is called the many-named, the thousand-named, and in Greek inscriptions, the myriad-named. So the Bible here is pulling from the inscriptions of this specific woman. In Revelation, when it says, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. This is an epithet that anyone who's initiated in these religions would understand and know about. So again, going back to Patai's book, as long as a god is alive, he can easily cross international frontiers and establish himself in a new country in superficially changed but basically identical image and function. This is probably what happened to Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. They arrived at different times, no doubt, among the Hebrews, and although foreign in origin, they soon adopted the Hebrews as their children. Another element of this that many people miss is the fact that we're talking about essentially a Babylonian religion. Goes back all the way, Isis and Inanna go back all the way to ancient Mesopotamia, where we have the Tower of Babel account. And when the Tower of Babel was built, as we all know, that was where God divided the language of the peoples. So if all of those people were worshiping one or two gods and goddesses, and then their languages were all divided, they would each take that god or goddess with them wherever they went, and they would each have a different name for her, but they would have the same functions. So this is probably part of what happened, but also it explains why when these people moved from one place to the next, they found a group of people that had the same god, or a different god but the same functions, and they were able to blend seamlessly with the previous god. And this is what happened with Israel. God specifically told them, do not blend with this religion. It has nothing to do with my relationship with you. And Israel continually wanted to play with the Canaanite toys. Further on, Patai states that gods are rarely invented or discovered, but rather they are taken over by one group from another. So they're passed back and forth through warfare, through marriage, through migration, and they just kind of play the shell game with each other and change their names back and forth. But archaeologists typically agree that all of these ancient fertility goddesses were used interchangeably by the people of their time. Comparative religion, however, teaches us that there is in man an equally great or possibly even greater need for yet another symbol, that of the divine woman, that divine word's popping up again, who appears in many different forms throughout the world, yet remains basically the same everywhere. So this is validating every concept about this revelation harlot, where she is known throughout the world, she sits upon the peoples, the seas, all of the people groups, yet she remains basically the same. These identifying features are always the same. So this exactly is the thing that God is castigating. Just as Asherah was known as the queen of heaven, a mother, a fertility goddess, a harlot, a virgin, and a tree goddess simultaneously, the offshoots and evolution of her deities spread throughout the world under different names, yet they retained all the same major qualities and titles as the Asherah of the Bible. So you can essentially see Asherah as the trunk, and all these other names and goddesses are branches. The same features, same elements, same personality, even the same relationship with her lover. The only difference here is the name. And this is something that all archaeologists agree on. So we know from Revelation 17 that the great prostitute is riding on the beast, the nations and powers of end times. We also know the same beast that the harlot rides on is referenced in a different form in Daniel's vision of the statue and the four beasts. So John sees this image of the nations in the form of different animals and different creatures that blend in different ways. Daniel saw the exact same, or I should say Nebuchadnezzar saw the exact same set of nations, but in the set of different metals. So Babylon being the head of gold, Persia being the arms and chest of silver. Then you have the Greek Empire with the belly of bronze. You've got the legs of iron, and then which is Rome, and then you have the feet of clay and iron, which is the blended Roman. And you'll see what the clay is. The clay references Adam and mankind and Israel. So essentially, you're seeing a Roman blend of Israel, the potter's clay. But the forms of these the forms of the goddess that are depicted in this, sorry. So we know that the statues are the same, and if the woman rides upon the beast of Revelation, she's also going to show up in the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar statue. So if you go to each nation and their national transition of power, you'll see this deity in every single one of these major religions and systems. And in essence, you will be able to trace this woman all the way to the feet. So if we look at, let's see, I'm going to put my face over here. If you look at some of the common roles of these deities, the goddess is known in different names, like I said, in all of these kingdoms, but they are essentially the same goddess. They have the same titles, and they have the same images associated with them. So in Babylon, you had Ishtar, Inanna, Eshratu, Asherah, and there are many more than this. These are just the primary ones from this culture. The Persians and Medians were Anitis and Anahit. The Greeks, Cybele and Astarte. Romans typically called her Cybele, Diana, or Aphrodite. And we'll find out about the feet. But anyway, you've got the common titles of Goddess of Fertility, Queen of Heaven, Mother of the Gods, Goddess of Love, Divine Mother, Virgin, Harlot, and Goddess of the Sea, being the peoples. And her common images were a tree, a star, a moon, a serpent, a naked woman, a winged woman, or a naked woman riding a lion. And sometimes that naked woman riding the lion also had wings. So you see different elements of this picture in different depictions of her, and it's just referencing which piece they're trying to draw out in that specific image. Back up to the top. Sorry for disorienting you all. All right, so we're going to start with the head of gold, and we're going to trace each one of these by their names, and again see if the fertility goddess of that religion tracks with the identifying features of the harlot of Revelation and with Asherah. So the direct heir, according to Patai, the direct heir of Inanna in Mesopotamia was Ishtar, the great goddess of love and war in the Akkadian pantheon. The identity of the two is attested by the fact that in some Akkadian texts, the two names are used interchangeably. In the Babylonian Ishtar, however, a certain shift occurred in the balance between the virginal and promiscuous roles of her character, to the extent of making her a divine harlot. So again, you see they'll use different names of this goddess just to refer to different parts of that personality that they're trying to draw out and depict for that particular story. But it doesn't mean that the elements aren't there. It just means they're trying to highlight certain elements in said pictures. Okay, I'm going to give this back to you again.
It's my turn. Okay. So here's some images. We've got all kinds of fun ones. Lots of fun stuff.
Oh, tell them where you got these.
Okay. So first off, these are actually quite easy to come by. Most of these artifacts, I just went to databases from very world-renowned museums that had archives of, ancient artifacts. So I went to like the Met database, the Louvre, the Vatican database, all kinds of databases for ancient artifacts. And so all of these are from this, in this case, Babylon. And there's some very interesting, so we're just going to take a look at some of these. So sometimes you will see, so most of the time in ancient fertility goddesses, you will see a nude woman. But in some cases, you'll see them, especially in like Babylon and Greece. But in Egypt, most of them were typically clothed. But you'll see in especially Babylon, most are nude. And you see here is an image of a woman, hands raised, and she has this crown above her head, and she's nude, obviously, and she's a winged woman. And this one, it's interesting, she's standing on goats, which is very, and same in this image, she's standing on two goats. Or gazelles in this case. We've also got, in this one's from Mesopotamia.
Gotta move this again.
Oh.
This is very much not professional.
Yes. We're going to do what we're going to do. So in this one, you see there's trees also symbolic of this deity. So this is very interesting. In this one, this is Sumerian Inanna. She's winged, but also these wings, so these are considered her feather dress, and she's got her wings, and then she has her crown. And the crown to me has always looked like Medusa. It looks like a snake wrapped around her head. So I find that quite interesting. I don't have any connection to that, but it's just an interesting parallel. This one's 2000 to 1800 BC. I find it also interesting that it also kind of reminds me of a tree. Looks kind of tree-esque. So here we have our 8-pointed star of Inanna, representing the planet Venus, and we obviously see that in both Greek and Roman mythology too. And this one's called a Vorka vase. This is a libation cup for their offerings. It was an offering to Inanna's eunuch priests, so they were castrated. For the Ishtar temple at Ebla, 3000 BC. So you see, here's the high priest,
and we see nude. And the eunuchs, it's really quite tragic. The eunuchs are always pictured naked, and it's always quite humiliating, degrading, in my opinion. But here we have, they're bringing offerings, and they're smiling, they're happy. And they're bringing offerings for Inanna, and they are priests. And you will see that all over these fertility. You'll see it in all of these cultures, especially Babylon, Greece, Rome, that the priests of this deity were castrated. They castrated themselves, and they lived in service to the goddess the rest of their lives. So this is not a abnormal thing for them to see of that time, and we obviously see that in Persia too. What do you think? The eunuchs of Esther's time, they probably also carried out priesthood duties of that time. It wasn't just guards at
Harem.
yeah, the harem. So anyway, also in and of itself, they always believed that the queen was the embodiment of the goddess. So in and of itself, they would be serving Esther as a goddess. Not saying that's correct, but that was their culture. Okay, let's move on. So this is a very interesting picture, and we'll reiterate this picture. But we have a winged goddess again, a nude winged goddess with her hands raised. She has a horned crown, and she's standing on a beast with owl's feet. You see that she's both half woman, half owl. So that's quite interesting picture. And then owls on each side. So again, we're seeing that all of this iconography represents the deity itself. It's not just like decor. It is another essence of what the deity resembles. So anytime you see other images around a plaque of a deity, those are its images associated. So here we also have Ashtar with Hathor head. So this is a very Hathor-esque head. And snakes, and she's standing on a little lion, but you see the snakes around. That comes into play later. So here we see that she's quite androgynous looking, and we'll get into that. She's got this warrior gear, and she's winged. And yet again, we see these like feather-like dress. And then the morning star we have, and here she has her lion on a leash, and she's has her leg on the lion. Now, knowing that our Messiah is the Lion of Judah and our God is a ravenous lion, this is extremely a blasphemous image. She's showing ownership. She's showing this lion, this beast submits to me. So, I mean, what do we see in Revelation? It says that she's riding a beast. Now, obviously, that means the nations, but it also is, I mean, it's an image that they are, they would have seen in Rome, in Roman artifacts. So John would have been very familiar with what this looked like. So let's proceed. So this is more on the eunuch priests. So the queen of Nippur state that Ishtar turns men into women and women into men. The goddess herself had androgynous traits, including a bearded aspect associated with Venus as the male morning star, and we'll see that here. I'll explain that in a little while. While her evening star aspect was female. She had transgender priests, male to female, who underwent castration. Nothing's mentioned about female to man, female to male trans folk participating. Both Wimber and Stuckey highlight the cross-dressing, gender-switching, sex-altering powers of Ishtar. So this was very common in the entire cult practice of the ancient Near East. There was, in all of these fertility deities, there was eunuchs that gave their life up and their manhood up for obeisance to the goddess. And they'd essentially marry the goddess and marry the deity.
Did you keep the information on Jezebel's eunuchs, or did you cut those out? If not, it's fine. Just
yeah, I think it's earlier.
No, it's not in there. Just mention it.
Are we gonna just cut this out?
Just mention it and we'll
Okay.
clip it.
Okay. So anyway, you also see this throughout Scripture. We see this in Jezebel. Jezebel had priests, and they were eunuchs. She was familiar with this custom. And also we see this with Esther. Now Esther, she was a obviously Hebrew princess, but she was in exile to Persia. And in Persia it was the same thing, that these eunuchs would they would sacrifice their lives for this female deity. Now, also, it is important to know in Egyptian culture and Persian culture and Babylonian culture that these kings and queens were associated with the lineage of the gods, and some were even associated as the god or goddess themselves. So these eunuchs in the harem were doing priestly duties of their cult by serving these women that could potentially become queen, because these queens would this queen one day would essentially be the goddess figure that they saw as the embodiment of the goddess on earth. Now, not saying that's correct. Obviously, that is absolutely incorrect, and Esther did not believe in that. She believed in the one true God. But that was the culture that she was a part of.
Well, it's the same way God put the Hebrew men, like Daniel, into the priesthoods.
Yes.
He put the women into the priesthoods in their own roles, because the whole point was he was showing them, this is what you get if you don't want to be my priest. You're going to be a priest of the nation you sell yourself to.
Yes, correct. So we'll look at this. This is quite interesting. You can't even tell which deity is the man and which is the woman. If you look, so this is actually Inanna or Ishtar, and we have her morning star, the morning star up above her, and she's in like male warrior armor, and she has a bow in her hand, so she looks very extremely androgynous. And then you see she's riding a beast, and then right beside her is a palm tree, and palm trees were sacred trees of both Israel and Babylon and Persia of the time. So these images all are all in homage and all represent and are synonymous with her deity. So this is also at Ebla, the Ishtar temple at Ebla, 3000 BC. You see her co-gendered aspects shown by here. So this is quite interesting. So here comes this picture again we've already discussed. So a nude winged bird-footed goddess wears a crown composed of multiple horns. Her gaze directly engaged the attention of the viewer as she stands frontally with both hands uplifted, palms facing outward. Beneath her talioned feet appear two horned animals back to back. A demonic composite being, part bird, part human, is represented on this clay plaque. Her delicately modeled nude body is juxtaposed with powerfully clawed feet and wings that fall behind her like an open veil. She has been identified as the dark maid Lilith or Lilith, called Screech Owl in a biblical passage, Isaiah 34, that we'll get into. Like the nocturnal bird, Lilith makes her home in a tree, the Hulupu tree of Inanna. So that's very important. We're gonna go back into that. So notice that she makes her home in the tree, therefore her essence is the tree. So this picture is so interesting. This is an Akkadian cylinder, 2340 to 2150 BC. And this,
You're shaking it.
sorry. This is Gilgamesh. And here we see he's bending the halupu tree, bending it over. And here we see Inanna with her horned crown. And she is dragging Dumuzid, what they believe is Dumuzid, out of the halupu tree, out of the underworld through the halupu tree. Therefore, using this halupu tree, this image of the goddess herself, as a portal. Now that sounds like mythology, but when you see scripture and when you read scripture, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that idols, when you sacrifice to idols or when you worship idols, you are worshiping to demons. So therefore, these idols, like this culture knew, were synonymous with the image, and we know that these deities are demons. So this is actually proving what they believed and what they saw and what they knew was that these images were a portal for the deities to cross, for their presence to be known and to be made known with you.
It was permission for them to be wherever the image was.
Yes.
It depicted ownership.
And
in the Egyptian religion and actually architecturally, if the king wanted to designate a new zone for the sun god, he would build an obelisk, and that would make that zone his and designate it as.
yes, and that's why it's such a, that's why God specifically said you will be set apart for destruction if you put these in your home, because you're inviting demons in your home.
Whether you know it or not.
And I mean, of all the places, where did he come from? He came from the underworld itself to, out from the tree. So that's quite interesting. Now Noah's going to explain the scripture aspect of it. So here we go.
Just moving right along.
Got a picture here.
It's in my face. So the name Lilith, just like the name Asherah, has been cut out of most translations, but it does still remain in the Hebrew. In Isaiah 34, he says, "Come, you nations, and listen. Pay attention, you peoples." Now, some context, this is referring to the judgment of Babylon. So we're talking about the same context of the woman in Revelation. The same judgment is going on, but it's Isaiah's depiction of the judgment. So he says, "Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all that comes out of it. The Lord is angry with all the nations." Why all the nations? Because all the nations are obeying this woman. "His wrath is on all their armies. He will totally destroy them. He will give them over to slaughter. Her nobles shall be no more, nor shall kings be proclaimed there. All her princes are gone. She shall become an abode for jackals." I'm going to jump forward a little bit. You can read this at your own leisure. "It'll be an abode for jackals and a haunt for ostriches. Wildcats shall meet with desert beasts. Satyrs, which is half goat, half humans, which is the Baphomet and the scapegoat concept. So the Azazel goat, Azazel, according to the Book of Enoch, was a satyr. He was a half man, half goat. So you're seeing a blending of all these unclean things, the mixed humans. Lilith there shall repose and find herself a place to rest. Now he says, "Look in the book of the Lord and read. No one of these shall be lacking, for the mouth of the Lord has ordered it, and his spirit shall gather them there." So this is a physical representation. He's telling us that all of our answers to what these things are and what they mean are in his book. So all we have to do is go to the book and understand it. In the Hebrew, it specifically says Lilith is not just an owl, but the name of a female goddess known as a night demon who haunts the desolate places of Edom. So the hoot owl correlates with Lilith. They are one and the same, and you can tell that by context where it refers to Lilith, and then it directly connects to the owl where she lays her eggs and hatches them. And this isn't a difficult stretch either, because in the garden, the demon that led Adam and Eve astray was associated with the serpent. But it wasn't specifically a serpent, it was a demon that associated with the serpent, and therefore he became connected to that serpent. The same way with the owl here. Lilith, the goddess, associated with the owl, and therefore the name became synonymous. Okay, back to you.
Sorry, we're going to do a lot of back and forth. Okay, so here we have Persia. This is the chest of arms in silver. So here we have, so there's not much in Persia. There's not much. There's not many artifacts found in Persia of Anahita, but there's several. There's a couple. So here's 4th to 6th century BC, silver and gilt vessel. I'm assuming that this would be a libation vessel, assumed to be depicting Anahita naked with wings. And look, there's a serpent wrapped around both of her arms, and I find it very interesting that it's wrapped around her wrists. It's almost like a shackles. It's quite interesting. And then obviously we see these little dainty wings up here, and she's nude. So it's the same image that we've seen. Here is the astral emblem of Anahita. This looks almost identical to the ones of Ishtar. This looks like the morning star. And then here, this also looks identical to Babylon, those libation cups that we saw. This is another libation votive. And here we see Anahita, and then we see the eunuch, and the eunuch looks, identical to the Babylonian eunuchs. And here they're offering libations. If you see up here too, it's quite hard to see. It looks like a small plant that this eunuch is watering, this vase with this plant. And this is early dynastic 2500 BC. And then she's standing on water. I never noticed that. They're standing on and walking on water, what looks to be water. So that obviously in and of itself is blasphemous.
And another association to her Asherah of the sea.
Yes, obviously that's another association of Asherah of the sea, or she's a seafarer. So these are, Cybele. Bear with us. Cybele is very pervy. So God bless us all. So some of these are ancient, and this one is more of a modern day. So this is more classical Greek or classical Roman, and she's draped with like Roman drapes, and she's in a chariot. So eventually it went from the deity riding the lion or riding the beast to having a chariot where the lions are attached to the chariot. So we'll see right here, this is a terracotta mother goddess, 6000 BC, so that's very old. And she's sitting but in the midst of two lionesses, it appears so. And then obviously she's nude. And then here we have, this more classical Roman, what we think of as Roman and Greek. And then this is a vase fragment. This was found from the Museum of Boston. And it's Cybele riding a lion. So here, this is a more ancient picture of her riding it. And it looks very almost Persian. It doesn't look as Greek as you would suspect. So this is where it gets really just bizarre. Lord help us. So this is Artemis and Cybele. They kind of coincide in this. So our Artemis and Cybele were, like we've stated before, the same deity but just different names. And several of these are a depiction from the Temple of Artemis, which was at Ephesus. So think about Ephesians, think about all of the things that they were doing. This is what they saw on a daily basis, was this. So let's have some grace for these people.
Were trying to pull people out of.
Yes, they were trying to pull these people out of this evil cult practice. So there's so much going on here. We'll start here. Now these you'd think are boobs. They are not. They are bull's testicles, which gets even more beyond demonic. So all of these you see, you'd think that they are nipples. No, they're not. They're bull's testicles. Pretty gnarly stuff. You also see we have goats here. So there's so much goat comparison. And then also if you look, there's also lions in this picture. And here, what does this crown look like to you? To me, it looks like the Tower of Babel. And same with this one. Nothing new under the sun. And then you see this as well. So these are just all we have, but they believe this to be lions, of course, as we can see from other ones. And they're all the same, and these are recreations of what was in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. So very demonic things. So here is some more clothed people. So this is great. Much better. So here, this looks more traditional Greek, traditional Roman. So they also, and this is a lot. We have several sources referenced. There's a book called History's Vanquished Goddess, Asherah, and it explains that this deity started getting here we go. History's Vanquished Goddess Asherah. This is a great book. It has so many artifacts. So if you want more information on this, this is your book. It has so many pictures, so much sources. It's great. All archaeological. So, in this book, it explains that eventually the nudity got a little bit too much for the masses. So they started adding clothes to these goddesses. So it's interesting when it says, I think in Nahum, where it says, I'll strip your garments. It's like stripping her back to what she was to show people, because people are more modest nowadays. And people see, nudity, and it's, I mean, some of these images are quite startling for, especially Christians. They're quite startling, and they're quite demonic. And so this softens it up a little bit. And I mean, look at all the people that have Roman art and even their homes. They're all throughout the museums. And Roman art, what is it? It's all Greek, Roman gods and goddesses. It's these deities that are clothed. So now, it looks more presentable to the masses. A huge example of this in today's society is, don't hate us, Starbucks. Is it not? At first, they had the image of the mermaid, which, what deity was it?
It was the Dagon counterpart.
Dagon, the Dagon fish goddess of,
but it was also a fertility goddess. It was an offshoot of
yes.
Asherah.
And so, obviously it's an offshoot, a lady of the sea. It's the same thing. And so here, at first, when they had the image, it was her nude with her, her hair and then her fish tail. But now they just add her face and the star, or the crown. So
you can look up if you're interested.
You can look up the evolution of the
Starbucks logo.
The Starbucks logo. They have done the exact same thing. They have made it more appealing to the masses and made it more digestible for the masses. And this is the exact same thing. So this is more classical Greek. And here, so we'll talk about Attis. This is Attis right beside her lover slash son. Very weird. So, and then obviously we have Apollo here. Not as much prevalent in this study, but here she is with the chariot of lions in both of these. And she's beside her lover. And these are 20 to 400 or 200 400 AD in this one, and this one's 2nd century BC roughly. We also see the morning star and the moon. So she's also associated with both the moon and the morning star. So we see both of these images. And if you see, all of these relate to her. All of these relate to her. And these are her valiant guardians, essentially, too. So these images, it's showing you that all of the images, it's not just for decor. Everything had significance about the essence of that deity. So that's very important to keep thinking. So this is very interesting.
Telling the story of what she was doing.
Yes. Quite interesting. Okay, so this is quite interesting. These are two different frescoes. This is 125 AD. This is 1st century BC. This is the Sacred Grove at Pompeii, third style, cubiculum, 16 north wall. The scene takes place near a rural sanctuary as identified by a sacred tree with a column with a ritual vase on the abacus. Abacus. At its base is a female deity on a throne, possibly Cybele. Two women and a child proceed towards the sanctuary bearing boughs or torches while a shepherd watches, and a shepherd is symbolic of Attis. Behind them is an ithyphallic? Okay, we're going to have to redo this. I'm just going to do this part.
It's a phallic symbol.
Oh, okay. I got it. At its base is a female deity on the throne, possibly Cybele. Two women and a child proceed towards the sanctuary bearing boughs or torches, while a shepherd watches, symbolic of Attis right here. Behind them is a phallic priapus, Italy, Roman, period date 125. So here we have the phallic symbol, the sun pillar, ironically enough, and this is the sacred grove right here. Quite interesting, 125 AD. And they believe that this at the base is Cybele, which she's synonymous with her tree. She's right at the base of it. So we come over here, 1st century BC, same time period. But this is a Roman fresco of the sacred grove of Diana at Nemi at Rome. Shows the same sacred tree ritual in a different setting. This looks almost identical and they're different places. Is this not insane? This is the same century, and we have this in Pompeii, which is to Cybele, and then this was at Nemi, or Rome, the sacred grove of Diana, and we see this dark right here. It's very, very hard to see, but we see this phallic symbol, and there is the tree behind it. So, I mean, crazy. Here we go.
Okay, yeah, I'll take it from here.
Yeah.
All right, so continuing on to the legs of iron, we're following Diana. Going back to the Golden Bough, Frazer states, down to the decline of Rome, a custom was observed here, which seems to transport us at once from civilization to savagery. In the sacred grove of Nemi there grew a certain tree, round which at any time of day, probably far into the night, a grim figure seemed to prowl. In his hand he carried a drawn sword, and he kept peering warily about him as if every instant he expected to be set upon by an enemy. So this sacred grove was known as the Sacred Grove of Diana Nemorensis, that is, Diana of the Wood. And he goes on to elaborate, if the sacred tree which he guarded with his life was supposed, as seems probable, to be her special embodiment, her priest may not only have worshipped it as his goddess, but embraced it as his wife. There is at least nothing absurd in this supposition, since even in the time of Pliny, a noble Roman used to do this to a beautiful beech tree in another sacred grove of Diana on the Alban Hills. So it was actually very common, and even to this day in some remote tribes, where they still have ceremonies of marriage to these trees. And whenever this tree, the sacred tree at the middle of these groves of Diana would symbolize the goddess, and her priest would guard that tree with his life, and essentially there would be this game of regicide where he would remain her priest until another high priest who was strong enough, basically anyone could come and challenge this priest at any time and kill him. And if he killed the previous priest, then he got to take over the rights and auspices of the kingship until he got killed. Okay, there's some more pictures.
Okay, so here we have, this is Diana. It's a mosaic 2nd century. And this is quite interesting. I mean, obviously she's nude, and then there's a serpent at her foot. And she's wearing a crown. And then these are her nymphs bathing with her. So this is the bathhouse. Here's another one. So look, we see that they're synonymous with the tree, and then in this image, the gazelle. So she's obviously also considered a hunter. Yeah, her art is evolving. Her she's also a hunter god deity, Artemis, but you see that she's also associated with the tree. That's all there. And then here we have a denarius. This is the head of Diana and her triple cult on the back, her triple cult statue. So that's her nymphs right here. Interesting. So here we have, this is an ancient depiction. This is 6th century BC. And we have her clothed, a winged goddess with a crown. And then we see, these are more modern. These are 18th century paintings. We have Diana with the moon right above her head. It's showing, obviously, ownership and that she resembles the moon. And same here, we've got a moon crescent above her head. So that is not unintentional. That's not just, oh, let's add a moon here. It's all to show ownership of the deity. Okay.
I think that's the last back and forth now that we're done with Rome. So
Yeah, I think so.
we can finish up from here. So now we're going to go back to Revelation where he says, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, many peoples, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. And you'll see later on, the sexual immorality isn't just marrying this tree or this goddess or this deity and serving her. It's the things that are done in her rituals, and we'll deal with that later. But this first part is just setting the foundation of the iconography and the imagery and connecting all of the dots so that we don't look crazy when we go forward and draw out these rituals and show how even the rituals are the same from time to time and place to place. So Isis, according to Frazer, in her later character of patroness of mariners, the Virgin Mary perhaps owes her beautiful epithet of Stella Maris, star of the sea, under which she is adorned by tempest-tossed sailors. So even the Virgin Mary, from the Roman Catholic Church, they took these Isis imageries and they connected those to Mary, and essentially all of the Roman art of Jesus and Mary is a copy of this Isis Astarte and her male lover Tammuz. And we'll get into the male version of this later, but you see that even in the faith of the Roman Church, these imageries connect and they're drawn forward. So it becomes important to draw that line of distinction where you see what the Bible meant for us to be depicting Mary as and how these ancient religions have applied these images of this woman who was the mother of God to Mary, Jesus' mother, so that they could blaspheme her name and therefore his ownership of mankind. We'll get into that later, but just in the back of your head, kind of keep that back there and let it roll around as we get into this. Her full name was Lady Asherah of the Sea. Apparently her domain proper was the sea. And where did the beast of Revelation come up out of? It came up out of the sea, the peoples. It appears that Asherah held the position of the chief or mother goddess, mother of all the abominations of the earth. All of these elements are connecting, and these are unbiased archaeologists who are not trying to make these connections. It's seamless. The Bible is purposely quoting these concepts so that we know what to draw upon. More importantly than the title of the harlot as a sea goddess, we know the scripture tells us that she is seated in authority over the waters, which symbolize the peoples, the nations, and the multitudes. This means that the harlot in her image will be amongst us and in our worship in modern times. And we're proving that out. It follows all the way from the Babylonian head, or actually Mesopotamia, but the biblical account starts in Babylon, and it follows all the way down to the legs of iron. So it doesn't make sense if the feet of clay and iron are in our midst that the woman in this form of religion wouldn't also be among us. So to understand where she fits now, we can look at some of her contradictions, and those contradictions, while seeming to be have disparity with each other, they actually show us what the source is, because these elements weren't created out of nothing. People didn't just decide to make her a mother of a virgin mother and a harlot. They didn't just decide to make her a goddess of fertility and a goddess of war, a goddess of death and a goddess of love. These elements are entrenched into the original fabric of where this woman came from. And asking those questions, this took me about a year and a half to parse out and go, what is the reason for these contradictions and how does this all make sense? And when you look at it under this way, looking at Asherah as a depiction and picture of Eve, now that we've seen all these elements of the tree and the snake and the naked goddess feeding mankind, giving him wisdom, emasculating men, you can start to draw this picture to the source and the root, which goes back all the way to the Garden of Eden. And ironically, the Bible says in Isaiah that he tells the end from the beginning. And this study draws upon the last book of the Bible and the very first couple chapters of the Bible, connecting. And it shows that God's always been saying the same thing. The sin at the Garden of Eden is also the sin at the judgment. And the reason we're being judged in the end times is for the sins that we're committing that are copying the Garden of Eden. And the whole point of Scripture is to lead us away from those sins, to lead us away from our separation from God and back in His direction. So if we dig into this, now that we've kind of done a basic introduction to these goddesses and deities, now we can go back to Genesis and see if these correlations line up. In Genesis 3:20, it says that the man, Adam, named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all the living. So I will pause here and also say I'm not specifically saying that Eve was an evil person. What I'm saying is Satan took the opportunity of her sin to cause mankind to follow in her sin after her. So it's very likely that she and Adam both repented and spent the rest of their days attempting to make atonement for that sin. But the problem is, once that sin had been committed, the sin came into the world and we began copying it. So Satan, the accuser, immediately started blasting this moment of fall and making it an element for mankind to follow and worship and deify. And here the scriptures are going to prove out that this connection does, in fact, line up. So she, Asherah, was the progenitress of the gods. All other gods, numbering 70, were her children, including Baal, Anat, Mot, and the other chief protagonists of the Ugaritic pantheon. So he's saying here from the very beginning that she was always seen from all the way down to Ugarit, which is Mesopotamia, one of the first religion. This Asherah deity was the mother of all the gods, numbering 70. And the Bible actually specifically says that the number of the nations was associated with the number of the sons of Jacob that came into Egypt, which was 70. So God set the bounds of the nations at the number 70. And going back to Daniel, it says that the prince of Persia assaulted the angel who came to speak with him. And it specifically references that there is an angel over Persia. So you have these deities over as heads of the nations. So essentially, these 70 gods that she was the progenitress of are the rulers of their respective nation. Throughout all the religions of Mystery Babylon and all the nations under it, there is a central theme of a beautiful tree full of fruit, standing in the center of a garden, guarded by a serpent. In Genesis, the only tree described as beautiful was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's going to be really important later, because everyone always points to the tree of life as this beautiful tree that we're acknowledging and respecting. But the Bible never describes the tree of life as beautiful. So the fact that we're looking at a specifically beautiful tree that's guarded by a serpent should instantly pique our attention and set off red flags that we're being lied to about the name of the thing that we're looking at. In each religion, the naked woman is lauded and worshipped as a goddess for plucking knowledge and wisdom and feeding it to mankind. And we're going to see this association. I'm going to draw on a couple more modern religions and concepts that all of you are familiar with, just to draw out that this concept went to every corner of the world. So people trace this back to Yggdrasil, but they don't trace it farther. And so Yggdrasil is a really good pivot point to show that it's always been the same. It goes all the way back to Mesopotamia, and it goes all the way forward to nowadays. And ironically, Yggdrasil being the world tree was considered the large focal point of the world in that concept. So it actually is a focal point to draw our attention and connection back to Asherah, Astarte, and the tree goddesses. Just as a serpent guards the tree of Hesperides, the dragon Niogr, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he eats from the roots of Yggdrasil. The apples of the Hesperides, this sacred tree, was lauded as having apples that would give you immortality. And the serpent, again, coiled around the trunk to protect those apples from being eaten. Heracles, one of his stories in mythology, was his task was to steal one of those apples as one of his 12 labors. So we see this conflict arising all through mythology. Back to you.
I'm not done. My assignment is not over. Okay, so here we have on this side, this is, I believe, Akkadian. Nope, this is Babylonian. Oh yeah, that's Marduk. So this is the seal of Marduk right here, standing by the tree of life. This is Babylon. Then we have the tree of life. Um, this is Sumerian. This is Sumerian seal, the tree of life. And look what they're doing. They're they're decorating it. They're making it look beautiful. They're adorning it. And then this above, the top of it is quite interesting. It's like I believe that is Shamash. Yes, that is Shamash at the top of the deity. And here we have, this is a stone relief. I believe this is also Assyria. And it's like a stylized tree. We have these ones are quite interesting. So this is the same. This is just a more zoomed in picture. Here he's watering the tree just like we saw that eunuch in the Persian uh, eunuch give water to Anahit's tree. We have this priest watering the tree of life right here. Here's the king of Ur. This is 2120 BC around. The king worshiping the gods of Ur before building the tower of the tower, Mesopotamia. And here's another one. They're adorning this one too. And anytime you see hands lifted of like servants and stuff, it's paying homage, it's worshiping, it's bowing before. So here's the Assyrian tree of life. This is in Iraq, 865 to 860 BC roughly. Here's the actual carving, and here's a more like clean picture. We see Shamash at the top. It's the same solar disk. And then we see flowers adorning it. And then if you look here, right here, they are putting pine cones on it. So that's quite interesting. Very interesting. So yeah, you see right there, that's that. This is Sumerian. This is Dagon. That's Dagon worship. If you remember Jonah in the Bible, he was called to minister to. Man, I'm drawing a blank. Where was Jonah called to minister? I'm like completely blank. Nineveh. I was like no 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 no. I was like starting with an N. I was like it's an N. They were no 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 Nineveh. Okay, so anyway, I'm gonna start that over. So here we see these fish worshippers, and that is
Sorry.
that
Go
is.
back.
Oh, was it not on me?
No, just like I covered it up, so.
Oh, okay.
Just
So
start
here
the
we
slide over.
start. Here, I'll just do the slide over. I'll just like turn. Here, this is a Sumerian sacred tree, and we see these fish worshippers, and that is straight up. So they're Dagon worshippers, and if you remember in Jonah, Jonah was called to minister to Nineveh. This is that region. They worshipped Dagon, the fish god, and so they're
And this
dressed.
is where Starbucks comes from.
Yes, this is where Starbucks comes from. So, yep. And our society's obsessed with it. So that shows you everything about our culture, that we're obsessed with Starbucks. Sometimes people get it once a day, if not more. So here is, and then also you see it looks like it's also decorated with pine cones, which is quite interesting. And then we see this is also the Assyrian tree of life, and they're kneeling before it, and they're also adorning that tree of life as well. This one is quite interesting. I found this at the Louvre. These are figures. It's a terracotta figure. And this in front, they're all circled around a tree. So they're, giving homage to it. Here's that same fresco, the Sacred Grove of Diana at Nemi, and it's right next to a phallic symbol. Oh, dang. Boop. So there's that. That's 1st century BC. This is quite interesting. I just added this. I have not double checked this, but I just thought this was a quite interesting depiction and connection. There's naked vegetative axis, and there's palmlets, floral in character. So there's florals. There's flowers. There's stems knotted. So it's like all just woven together. There's serpent associations, which we know of, solar associations, cherubic associations, which we've also seen throughout. Cherubic associations, like half goat slash winged slash man, like winged bird slash man slash, aquatic affinities. We saw that with the Dagon Sumerian seal. Associated with kingship and its immortalizing essence. And I thought that was extremely, extremely profound. That's what we keep seeing, that this tree gives immortality. And that's what they believed, that it brought fertility and in some cases immortality, especially to the kings. So this, we're familiar with the Egyptian trees. So this is the Egyptian tree of life right here, and it's decorated with flowers, and it's, ornate. This is so interesting. This is Mesopotamia. It's very old, 2300 BC. They call it the temptation seal. And they likely believe this to be Adam and Eve. And Eve has a horned crown. And what do we have at the base? A snake. It's quite interesting. And here's the modern day Armenian tree of life. It's Oratorian. And I mean, it's the same winged beings decorating a tree of life and adorning it. Okay.
Do you want to do this part or do you want me to take it?
No.
And we're back again. So now that we've seen that this iconography was actually common in the even in the ancient cultures, we can go back to the Bible and clearly see that we're just looking at, there's two lenses. There's the biblical lens and then there's the pagan lens. And all of the pagan religions had the exact same lens, and the biblical lens has a different perspective. And ultimately it comes down to which perspective do you believe is right. So in Genesis 3, the woman says to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, just like all of these sacred trees at Nemi and all the Asherah, all the sacred groves had a specified, had a specified sacred tree in the center. But God said of the tree in the middle of the garden, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, you will surely not die, for God knows that in the day that you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, oh, it was pretty, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband, in the same way that Jezebel took these trees and gave them to her husband. Just like you see this woman taking the cup of her wine and giving it to the inhabitants of the earth, getting them drunk on this wine. It's the exact same thing that happened to Adam. Eve ate from the fruit, and he decided to go along with her. He took the fruit from her, and then he ate. So essentially, in the moment that he ate, he emasculated himself, which we will prove out further in these verses. He took away his own leadership that God had given him the command originally, and he was supposed to help guide her in that instruction. And instead of doing that, he followed her in her sin. And that's the same problem that happened with Jezebel. Instead of instructing Jezebel in the ways of the worship of the God of Israel, Ahab followed her along into her sin. So in that moment, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. It's not a coincidence that that several of these original deities were known as the sycamore fig goddess, because the leaves that they used to try to cover their sin were fig leaves. And in essence, what happened here was immediately when they found out they were naked, God wasn't coming to judge them. Even in that instance, had they not hidden and tried to cover their own sin, God would have found a way to forgive them, and the punishment would have been much less. But the problem is, they tried to cover their own sin, and you'll see as we develop into this that these rituals are all stemming from an attempt to cover our own sin, to cover the curse by ourselves with our own actions and our own witchcraft. And we'll get into that in the next couple phases. So it is logical that, according to Cusack, he states that it's logical if the sacred tree is a depiction of the cosmos, other subsidiary meanings will be attached to it, or will be comprehended by it. These include the symbol of the tree of knowledge, which possibly derives from associations with deities, or the putative presence of spirit beings that live within the tree, and they confer upon it oracular functions, just as the serpent coiled itself around the tree and spoke through the tree to Eve. He's stating that this idea, the concept of the sacred tree, is not only just a picture of the earth as a whole, but it's a picture of the spirits that dwell within it and speak to us from its branches. So according to Patai, this is a really difficult passage because the Talmudic view of this goddess, this is drawn out in Hebrews Vanquished Goddess and a couple other of my source books, which I will post all the source books and all of my sources later in the link to this, because there are quite a few of them. And like I said, I have a couple sources that I use more often than others because it's such a broad arcing set of works. But when you look at any other archaeological or academic research, they all line up and correlate with the concepts from these trunk principles. But anyway, in the Talmudic view of this goddess was attached to the Shekhinah, which biblically is the presence of God. So essentially, the Talmud has morphed, the Jews have also morphed this goddess into their religion, which is just as evil as all the other depictions. So they're saying that the presence of God is the mother goddess, and the Shekhinah was Deathbringer, according to the Zohar. He specified that in Proverbs 5, when it says her feet go down into death, that it was symbolically representing the forbidden tree for which Adam was a tree of death. So you're seeing the principles and the concepts in the ancient mind's eye all centered around this moment of death, this moment where we went to this woman and this tree and followed her into the underworld. Genesis 2 extrapolates, going, "You are free to eat of any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." So these concepts are stacking, where all of these religions are saying that this woman is feeding mankind from the tree of life. But if you look at it, you go to the story, the reason she became the goddess of death and the goddess of war and the goddess of adultery and the goddess of love and all of these elements, the evil came from the fact that she was feeding mankind from the tree of knowledge. That was the moment when death came to us, and so therefore she absorbed the pictures of that death. So the attributes of each goddess here are in direct contrast to the curses that God laid on Eve, i.e. an easier childbirth and ruling over man specifically. All of the worship, the festivals, the customs of the nations of the Near East all use the worship of the goddess in an attempt to break these curses of mankind, which we'll prove here in a second. The women went to Asherah, Isis, Hathor, Ishtar, Inanna, Cybele, and Diana to protect them in labor and to increase their fertility, instead of going to God and asking for forgiveness for this sin. So this is the sowing the fig leaves over their own bodies. So when God found Adam and Eve in the garden, they had sowed fig leaves on themselves. And when God comes back and finds us with fig leaves sown upon ourselves, where we're trying to copy these rituals to save ourselves, he's going to have the same response as he did the first time. He's going to send us away. The whole point is that we come to him and ask for forgiveness for this sin, and he'll forgive us for it. It's that simple. So here we're drawing out, to the woman, he says, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." We're going to, now that we've associated all these goddesses with the same trunk, the same tree, now we can look at what the function of these goddesses were and connect the fact that they did each combat the curse of Eve specifically. One of the reasons for Asherah's popularity may have been that she promoted fertility in women, and she facilitated childbirth, according to Patai. Her full name was Lady Asherah of the Sea. Apparently her domain proper was the sea, and it appears that Asherah held the position of chief or mother goddess, just as Eve was called by Adam the mother of all the living. In her character of a goddess of fecundity or fertility, Isis answered to the title of the great mother goddess of Asia. Of the worship of Diana and Nemi, some leading features can still be made out. It appears that she was conceived of especially as a huntress, just like Artemis, and further as blessing men and women with offspring, and with granting expectant mothers an easy delivery. Every single time, this is the primary function of this goddess. And it is a direct contradiction to Eve's curse. Hathor, we're going to Egypt, was the golden goddess, much like the golden calf, who helped women to give birth, and I will also extrapolate, Hathor was actually known as a cow goddess. So this was the golden calf that Israel set up in front of Mount Sinai, and this is why God was so furious. So if it infuriated God back then, when he was sitting there talking to them and speaking to them, it's still going to infuriate him now, and that's why we need to learn to hate this image. The curse is only on the people continuing in it after they know it's evil. So the curse is on the image, and God is trying to open his people's eyes to why he's cursing this image and telling us to leave it alone so that we don't get the same judgment as the goddess. But Hathor, the golden calf, helped women to give birth, the dead to be reborn, and the cosmos to be renewed. This complex deity could function as a mother, a consort, and a daughter of the creator sun god. Many lesser goddesses came to be regarded as names of Hathor, in contrasting her benevolent and destructive aspects. So this is where you start to see the branching of the names, where the goddess is known by many names because whenever they want to refer to her benevolent aspect, they'll pick one name. When they want to refer to her destructive aspect, they use a different name, but they all connect to the same tree. It's just a left, right, north, south, different segments of the goddess's personality. So a key element of nearly all the worship of the female deities was this ritual practice of the emasculation of the men. These rituals surrounded the peak times of the year, the spring and the winter equinoxes specifically, where the newly initiated priests would castrate themselves and they would take a lifelong vow to serve the goddess. And they would actually take their testicles and throw them onto the image of this female deity. And this is where you get the representation of Artemis with the bull's testicles all over her. It's a representation of her eunuchs and all of the men that she has, the men whose virility she has stolen. And this is again in reference to the moment where Adam threw his authority to her, and in essence, he was throwing his authority to the serpent, and the serpent was pulling Eve's strings. So man chose to castrate himself, and so even though this part of the message is specifically referring to Eve, Adam doesn't get a pass either. In fact, he was the one that God initially gave that instruction to, saying, do not touch this tree. And the fact that he heard the words directly from God and chose to follow Eve in sinning makes him even more culpable than Eve. So the entire next section is on Adam and his curse, and man doesn't get off scot-free either. But the whole point of this is to look at and understand what the root cause of that sin was. Both for men, we need to look at the men's sin, what we did in that moment, and where we failed. And women need to do that same self-reflection and look at where they failed, and then only then can we come back together with each other and with God, because ultimately the curse was this infighting between men and women. You have this constant contention between the spirits, which is exactly because God initially created Adam and he gave him direct instructions, and Adam followed Eve into the serpent. So there becomes a conflict where man was made to lead in peace, and instead he followed into death. And this is a spiritual emasculation, is what I'm trying to say. In Genesis 3, the serpent tells Eve that as soon as she eats of the fruit, she will be like God. And he followed through with that promise to a T, because he established all of the world's deities, the gods and goddesses, to represent that moment. So they became, even though this wasn't what they wanted, when you make a deal with the devil, he always has fine print. Everybody knows this. From the very beginning, he made them like God, and they didn't knowingly choose this, but they still chose it, which shows us even today we don't have to knowingly make the choice for it to be a problem. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And those who want to worship the Father must worship in spirit and in truth. So in order to know the truth, we have to understand the root of this lie. So Satan established the gods through the world as a copy of Adam and Eve and their moment of eating from the forbidden tree, thus making them like God. Israel followed and participated in these festivals, again playing the part of Eve, where they went in as the bride of God, and they chased after Baal instead. So they chased after the serpent. They celebrated the moment mankind sinned, and they were separated from the Father. Instead of repenting for this great sin, they used witchcraft, and they prostrated themselves, and they sacrificed their children and emasculated themselves in honor of Satan to try to avoid the repercussions that God passed down, instead of owning up, accepting their sin, and repenting. This resulted in the Father drawing farther away from them and selling them to the gods they worshipped. And you see this all the way through the Bible. It's stages where the first sin is the Garden of Eden. They get kicked out, but God follows them into exile and tries to teach them how to make restitution for that sin. And immediately afterwards, he's speaking to Cain and Abel, and he tells Cain, "Don't follow after this spirit of anger. It desires after you." The exact same verbiage he used to Eve, he used on Cain. Cain ignored it, killed his brother. So now they're multiplying their sins instead of recovering from them. And so you see this constant move farther and farther from God, and ultimately every time the message is the same. When he sends the prophets, he's telling Israel, "Stop doing this so that I can come close to you again. I'm not mad at you if you'll stop." Jesus even said to all of the people he healed, "Go and sin no more. Your sins are forgiven." So just stop doing it. It's as simple as that. So far, we've put together that the great harlot symbolizes the goddess that Israel committed adultery with against God. Asherah and the other female deities of old all shared the same characteristics, the same roles, the same traditions, and the same symbols. The only differences in all of these goddesses seems to be the region they were worshipped in and their names. So the deeper meaning of Asherah worship, we have proven, was to deify Eve's sin and to simultaneously combat the consequences of that sin by turning to the serpent to mitigate God's curse over them. So instead of deciding that following the serpent was a bad idea and going to God and asking for forgiveness, Adam and Eve went and followed what the serpent said they needed to do to get rid of this curse, which is the sowing of the fig leaves. They went to cover their own sin. So we need to remember and focus in on the point of this study. It's to identify this great system of worship, why God detests it so completely, and lastly, to identify what that worship actually looks like in practice in our modern culture. So as we draw this out, the next part of the study is going to be the dying deity, Asherah's male counterpart, who reflects Adam. And again, this is another cross-check academically, because if only some of these associations are true and accurate, then it is a false association and it's a worthless one. But if we can connect Adam to this goddess, and the elements and biblical accounts of Adam line up with what happened in this moment, then we can start to build our case and prove that these religions truly are worshiping that moment of sin. And that would start to show why God doesn't want any trace of it in his culture, in his people, in his land. He's trying to remove death from our presence, not worship and deify it. So it's a conflict of interest where essentially he wants us to worship him alone and get any symbols or conceptualizations of the serpent out of his realm, so we are only listening to his voice. And I will be with you for the dying deity in the next section. Thanks for bearing with me so far, and hit me with any comments, any responses, questions in the comments, and I would love to hear what you guys got to say on it so far.